I'll be pulling from a variety of different sources, so as I flip pages back and forth, that's what I'm doing. Rather than copy things, I thought I'd just pull from the source documents. I'm going to back up a little bit before I talk about Pocatello and talk about Jews in the West in general. Started arriving in the Salt Lake City area as merchants in support of the gold rush. There was a Jewish Benevolent Society established in 1864 in Salt Lake City. They were meeting at the Masonic Hall. And to be chartered by B'nai B'rith requires 35 men, and Salt Lake City chartered in 1866. In 1867, they listed 39 names in their society. And for perspective, in 1880, the census stated there were 85 Jews in Idaho. In 1889, the group in Salt Lake City bought a property, and in 1890, when Idaho was made a state, there was the same 85 Jews were here. In 1891, they dedicated the temple in Salt Lake City. Sidewalk. That's it. 1, 2. Okay, that's it. Found the problem. Sidewalk put together our history of Temple Emmanuel. I'll be reading from that. I'll be reading parts of that. And the saga of Temple Emmanuel follows the early history of eastern Idaho. The area grew with the development of railroads, resulting in a mining boom in Montana in the 1870s. At one point, Butte, Montana was the largest city west of Chicago. And actually, the first Jewish settler in southeastern Idaho did not come to Idaho Falls or Pocatello. Meyer Cohen, who came to America in 1865 from Germany, settled in Malad on the Idaho side of the Utah border. He opened a general store and also went into cattle ranching. In 1885, the Cohen family moved to a ranch near what was later to become Aramo. And over the years, the land holdings became quite extensive. After Meyer's death, his son Max continued to operate the ranch. Flora and Sam Lewis settled in Montpelier in the 1890s and opened a general store. Sam's brother Simon had 2 sons who went to Pocatello. Ralph, who opened a ladies' shop, and Leo opened a clothing store. Sam had another brother, Ben, whose daughter, Sadie, married Nathan Levine. Nathan Levine. Sadie and Nathan went to Rexburg and opened a department store. Their son, Leo, opened stores in Idaho Falls and Pocatello. About the same time, Sam Lewis talked his brother-in-law, Harry Jacobs, into coming west from New York City. And Jacobs moved to Pocatello to open a store. A little aside about his brother-in-law, Harry. Harry Jacobs was born in Lithuania and moved to New York at age 12 with his older brother. His older brother was 13, so they were 12 and 13 when they moved to New York. He learned to run a store, became very successful as a young man, a teenager. He lost the store in a bad business deal, opened a new store in New York City, lost that store in another bad business deal, moved to Chicago, was starting another store there when he got the call to head west. In the mid-1890s, Harry opened a store in Pocatello and moved his wife and children here against the advice of many, Pocatello being a bit of a rough railroad town in the 1890s. He became very successful running a store. He became a land and gold speculator using the profits from his store. He proved to be a wonderful businessman, but a terrible land speculator. He moved on to Idaho to start a store in Idaho after he lost his money here, and eventually he moved to California to do another store there, and his children went further west to Australia. If you're going to go west, right? Harry Gasis, after having spent time in Kemmerer, Wyoming, and St. Anthony, moved and settled in the rough frontier town of Blackfoot, where he ran a saloon. In 1903, Harry Gasis' brother Barney came to Idaho Falls and opened what was to become one of the leading department stores in East Idaho. Barney and his brother Harry in Blackfoot, and his sister Florida Gasis Lewis in Montpelier, and his sister Ida Gasis Jacobs in Pocatello made up a significant portion of the Jewish population in East Idaho at the time. In 1914, 2 more Jewish merchants moved to Pocatello, Nate Morgan and Nate Block. Block opened a work clothes store, and Morgan established a jewelry store. Eventually, there were Morgan jewelry stores in Utah, Idaho, and Montana. The Block stores were enlarged and grew to become a chain of full-line apparel stores with 16 locations in eastern Idaho and northern Utah. In 1917, Julius Goldberg arrived in Pocatello. He also opened a jewelry store. His daughter, Fanny, married Myron Porges, who joined the family business. Along with Goldberg's nephew, Siebert Rudman, they formed a partnership and became R&G Jewelers in Idaho Falls and Pocatello. The Rudmans had two daughters, Dorothy Ann and Janice. Dorothy Ann and her husband Stan later took over the Idaho Falls R&G store, and Janice married Mel Morgan, son of Nate. Abe Scheiberg had a hide-and scrap iron business in Idaho Falls from 1918 to 1930. He briefly left Idaho, and he returned in 1933 to open the Pocatello Hide Wool and Fur Company with a partner, Bill McCarthy. Bill's wife, Fanny, was Jewish, and both families became pillars of the Pocatello Jewish community. At the same time, in the early 1900s, Idaho had the distinction of having the first and only Jewish governor in the country. Moses Alexander was our governor. He was the first Jewish governor in the country, and that was happening at the same time period. Many others were major forces in the nurturing congregation were Julius Goldberg, the Rudman, Barney and Cecil Goldberg. Myron and family Porges also had a son, also named Myron, who became an optometrist, known to most members as Doc. For about 40 years, Doc was the secretary, treasurer, and took care of the details nobody ever noticed until his absence was keenly felt after his death. In 1922, Julius Goldberg, Nate Morgan, and Nate Block took the responsibility for finding 35 men required for the foundation of the B'nai B'rith Lodge. This was accomplished, and on May 13, 1923, the charter was awarded. Now, many people ask, and probably most of you, how there came to be 35 Jewish men living in Pocatello in 1923. Well, there weren't. There was Fred Ball, Jack Stale, and perhaps others who had Jewish wives. Of the rest, some lived in Pocatello, some in Idaho Falls, and others lived in Rexburg, Blackfoot, or Aramoth. A few, such as Archie Lutzker, were more or less passing through, and there are names that no one recognizes. It's generally agreed that there were traveling salesmen who happened to be in the area at the time. But B'nai B'rith got their 35 names, and we were chartered. Meanwhile, Jews from all over East Idaho began to hold high holiday services in Pocatello. The congregation rented the Elks Hall Lodge, the white terracotta building near Arthur and Center Street. It did a great job for us. The stage in the hall had heavy velvet curtains. They provided a place for the young children to play during the lengthy high holiday services. There were also facilities for the preparation of Passover Seder. Unfortunately, that building was destroyed by a fire in the 70s. In the 1930s, Ned Grossman, who was the owner of two movie theaters in town, read the English portion of the services and also acted as our cantor. Sam Engbar was also his #1 assistant. He took care of the Torah and arrangements of services. His wife, Ethel, managed the food preparations, decorations, and such. Nate Block was the only one who could read directly from the Torah, so that became his job. He was also president of the congregation for about 40 years. At the same time, an official Jewish community was organized and later incorporated. Myron Porges was the first president, and Julius Goldberg served as secretary. According to the American Jewish Yearbook of 1927, the Jewish population in East Idaho reached a peak of about 140. If that number was correct, it has not been surpassed since. When Ned Grossman left Pocatello, Leo Levine became lay leader. Years later, the lay leaders of Temple Emmanuel were recognized by the state and legally empowered to perform marriages and other life cycle ceremonies. And after that, it was no longer necessary to bring a rabbi from Salt Lake City for weddings and funerals. There were a number of rabbi substitutes over the years. Someone once asked, "What happens when one of our leaders leaves?" The reply was, "God will supply a new one." And somehow that's always happened. In 1946, a local church moved to larger quarters, and its old building was for sale. The Jewish congregation, with Nate Block as president, bought it and named it Temple Emmanuel. The door had a Gothic arch, and a bronze plaque was made that created a fit on the arch to proclaim to all that the Jews there are now at home. That arch, that plaque now sits in our lobby back there. That's where that plaque came from. By 1961, Temple Emmanuel felt the need for a more suitable edifice. The congregation bought a piece of property next to the city limits on the eastern edge of Pocatello. That's where we are right now. By coincidence, the lots were among the land bought from the Shoshone Bannock tribe in 1889. For many years, there had been a dispute between the U.S. government and the tribe and the city of Pocatello about who owned what. And of course, this property was part of that dispute, but the conflict was finally resolved in a friendly manner, and the temple's only expense was legal representation, which was mostly donated. The congregation sold the old property and began a plan for a new house of worship. In 1960, Idaho State University had a Department of Architecture, although it no longer does today. At the time, professor of architectural history was a member of our congregation, David Fisher. He contributed his many talents to the new synagogue. Once again, God had provided. Designing the new building was a work of love for Fisher. He wanted it to be simple, serene, and inviting, as well within the limited means of a small congregation. Because of his skill and imagination, he succeeded. Using a modular plan, he conceived to make the best use of materials. Every wall and corner of the building was plotted to coincide with a line or form on graph paper. The roof of the chapel is also its ceiling. The outside brick walls became inside brick walls, And although such plans do not attain the energy efficiency we look for today, they were cutting edge at the time. And because of the time and its cutting energy, this building has been described as a classic mid-century modern example of architecture. Shortly after designing the building, David left Pocatello to join his family's land development business, and the congregation turned to Clarence L., a local contractor, to build the synagogue. He said he did not know how much construction would cost, but that he would build it complete at a price the congregation could afford. Clarence was one of many true friends of the Jewish community. Meanwhile, the congregation was raising funds, and the building was soon paid for. The cornerstone in 1961, and the bronze arch is in our vestibule. At the dedication, Cy Block, then president of the congregation, reflected that with never more than a handful of actively participating members, Temple Emmanuel has carried on the 3,000-year-old lineage, heritage of Judaism. Its members have not only observed and taught the tradition of their faith, but have done their share to act as good citizens in the community. So I'm going to circle back to the comment I said about they built that first temple in Salt Lake City in 1889. When we moved in this building, they were getting rid of that building. Their chandelier is hanging above you right now. That is the chandelier from the original temple in Salt Lake City. Later, we had our stained glass windows installed. I'm going to get the date wrong. Maybe Mary can correct me on the date. It was 91, I think, maybe? 91, I think we got our stained glass windows installed. Prior to our stained glass windows, we had floor-to-ceiling curtains. The curtains, which we no longer needed, were donated to the West Side Players Community Theater, where they have been used on stage many times. We've been blessed with many literary people coming through our congregation, either as members or as visitors. And one of them is Nancy Goodman. And in December of 2009, Nancy Goodman was a writer, an independent writer for the Jewish magazine called Lilith. And she wrote an article introducing Jew Idaho. Within 2 hours of telling my parents I was moving to Pocatello, Idaho, my dad found the local synagogue online, contacted the religious leader on my behalf. There would be no escape. Not that I wanted to escape from Judaism. No, I was a good immigrant Jewish stock. I had a bat mitzvah. Went to Osprey and Onawanacock, Wisconsin for summer camp, one of the many who attended on scholarship. Yet since my 20s, I've been drawn, led by eclectic caravans roaming the far permanent diaspora where Jews mix primarily with non-Jews and talk about weird things like feminist spirituality, Buddhism, and pre-Judeo and pre-Christian paganism. Not to mention neo-psychedelia, neo-Youngism, neo-feminism. Terms I made up myself to catalog the thoughts that dance around in my head. So on a bright August morning in 1998, we removed the last of my residual belongings from my dad and mom's house in Skokie and headed west. It was comforting to have a contact for Temple Emmanuel in Pocatello, although the information I also had about the First National Bar proved to be more socially fruitful for the first few years. My original plan, moving to a town I'd never heard of, in a state everyone kept confusing with Iowa, was to live in Pocatello for 1 year, get some postgraduate professional experience, and then flee out to the real world. Because southeastern Idaho is no place for a nice single Jewish girl who doesn't want to die alone. At the time of this writing, it was over 11 years ago. And she's still here. And so it seemed like divine reward. I met my husband at age 35, after finally surrendering my unshakable feelings of the sacred place, Holy Land of Pocatello, and committing to stay spinsterhood be damned. 5 seconds after I got engaged, I lost my job again. Life has scuffed me up as much as it would here as much as it would anyplace else. And I suspect I'd rather have life run me through the trash in old historic Pocatello than any place else on the planet. I am grateful for the opportunity for Lilith to sift through the past decade to see how, in this high desert, my experience of being Jewish has developed. Here in Pocatello, where dusty summer earth beneath my feet feels oddly familiar, it's hot. It doesn't rain, bushes catch on fire, often, and at night during a new moon, the triangle of sky of stars explodes around my house. Given my spiritual nature, living in a small town has perhaps created a stronger Jewish identity than if I lived with a kosher deli in every corner. So much to explain to non-Jewish friends and paramours. Such a sense of protective cultural solidarity. And being Jewish in Pocatello is like being in a college class with 9 students. Every voice counts, and you can't hide in the back. There are Jews in Pocatello, sometimes a lot, sometimes not so many. There's a freestanding, paid-for synagogue on a generous lot. Temple Emmanuel is the only Jewish act in town, and the lay rabbi and philosopher Dr. Carl Levin skillfully navigates the comings of our congregation in a sea of onlookers, many who call us Gentiles. The Jewish population in southeast Idaho is colorful and surprising as the region itself. We work in a desert, we work in the mountains, we work on farms. We have a matriarch we share with half the Pocatello community. There are those with children in Israel, and there are those with a dozen chickens in their backyard. So now that you know a little about me, let me show you how Wild West Judaism is done. So Wild West Judaism has been a theme for many years. And a little while before that, Frank Rich of the New York Times came through. Make sure I'm in the right place. I keep my notes together. Let me back up. And Dan Yerman, back in 2017, he wrote an article for a Cleveland newspaper talking about this same thing, about if you're going to be Jewish in Pocatello, you have to think about it. He talked about the fact that in Cleveland, where his family was from, there was a deli at every corner. There was 15,000 Jews in Cleveland at the time he lived there, but had grown in the time he was here. So Dan talked about also to be Jewish here is done on purpose. Since the middle to late 80s, most of our congregants are not second generation members of our congregation. I don't think we have any at the moment. Everyone here is a first generation member of this temple. My children have moved away. Other people's children have been raised here and moved away. Other people have brought their parents here. Nancy Goodman brought her parents here. So it's a congregation made up of people who've decided that practicing Judaism, maintaining traditions matters. So we maintain traditions, we maintain spirituality, and we also try to be active in our community. At the request of and the sponsorship of a local Jewish family in November 2018, Temple Emmanuel helped assemble and distribute 130 Thanksgiving dinner boxes throughout the area. So this was a gentleman he's a family. He wrote the check, he organized it, we just provided the space and the labor to put them together. And in March of 2020, in response to the pandemic, when things had to change, we started doing online discussions. And the online discussions, because of the nature of the internet, people found out about them. I had members of the community who joined the online discussions, who moved away long ago. A man from California moved away 25 years ago. And then I got interesting long discussions with a woman named Gloria Geisis. And Gloria talked about remembering Temple Emmanuel, remembering Pocatello, and her family had moved away before we finished the new building. The new building we're in right now was built in 1961. So Gloria remembers before, when we didn't have new building or something, she remembers being part of that small community. In the history written by Cy Block, he mentioned several religious leaders and how we choose the next one. He said, when we need one, God provides. And based on that, you can look around. If you look around at pictures in the back of our building, you'll see several pictures with rabbis in them. These are the rabbis we brought in from Salt Lake or from Boise to help with confirmations and bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and weddings. But we've had a string of religious leaders, all of them lay leaders, Ned Grossman was mentioned earlier, Leo Levine, Noah Klein, who's still in town, but aging and mental health, Carl Levinson, who is professor at ISU, who's moved on, Deborah Shine, who was also a professor at ISU and has moved on. That led to me being standing here in front of you. And we have a leader. Somebody once asked, what do you plan to do there? I said, I will be at the front of this room until somebody else comes along that is much better qualified. And last September, that person came along in the form of Sarah Goodman, who will be Rabbi Sarah Goodman next month. So that's how we keep going on. And Temple Emmanuel continues to fill several functions. We are the home for Jewish study and worship in East Idaho. We're a resource for the greater community about Judaism, and we're an active partner in our city, state, and region. We've been here for a long time. We plan to stay here. Thank you.